Moscow, capital of Russia and the largest city in Europe. Both Tsar rule and Soviet communism gave the city its present appearance. Moscow has witnessed much change and has become a prosperous city and one of contrast and the superlative, of millionaires and also the very poor. But its historic charm of a fairy tale city remains intact. Vasilia Blazhenovo Khram Basilius Cathedral is one of the main landmarks of the Russian metropolis. Holy Vasily is buried here. This famous sacred building was built at the command of Moscow sovereign Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar. The cathedral is representative of Moscow's architecture with red brick monuments and an accumulation of onion-shaped towers. That was the time when the mainly Islamic Tatars were defeated militarily, an event commemorated by this church, a triumphant building of faith. Today a monument stands in front of the cathedral. It features Minin, the oldest citizen of Novgorod, the sovereign Pozarsky, who commanded the French Franc-Tireur, or irregular army. In 1612, they forced the Polish occupiers to withdraw from Moscow and brought an end to a time of confusion and disarray. Great history in a large square, Red Square. Here, the Kremlin extends beyond a red wall and various towers that date back to the 15th century, the center of power. Moscow's Kremlin, since time immemorial the seat of both Tsars and bishops. In front of its walls is the large square that since its construction was used as a marketplace and also a place of execution. Here, the death penalty was declared and immediately carried out. On the outer fortified wall is the mausoleum of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, father of the Socialist Soviet Union. Moscow's Red Square is probably the most famous square in the world. But the name red does not refer to blood. It simply means beautiful. And it is flanked by famous buildings such as the History Museum and the GUM Shopping Center. In the 1990s, on the northern section of the square, the Church of the Mother of Kazan was rebuilt with the aid of public donations. Close to it, a circular metal plate was laid on the ground, the 0 point for each distant route from the city. Resurrection Gate separates Red Square from Managa Square. 2 passages lead through a double tower. Outside the History Museum, there's an equestrian statue of Marshal Zhukov, and above the Kremlin wall appears the Arsenal Tower. Along the rear of the Kremlin wall is a noble cemetery. Here lie the remains of many of the leaders of communist times. On the outer section of the Kremlin is the middle Arsenal Tower, and beyond it, the arsenal itself, the fortress' former armory. Adjacent is the Alexander Garden, with its trees, lawns, fountain, and equestrian statue, the last remaining green spot outside Russia's center of power. The Kotafia Tower announces the entrance to the Kremlin. It leads over a bridge. From here, the Kremlin can be entered through a gateway to the Trinity Tower. The word Kremlin means fortress, the most famous of which is here in Moscow. Above the city is the Kremlin, and above the Kremlin, only God. The huge Tsar's cannon at the entrance to the cathedral square has its own history. This 40-ton cannon was built in 1586. Cathedral Square is the center of the Kremlin, whose oldest cathedral is the Uspensky Sobor, created by the Italian architect Fioravante. It's very beautiful and has 5 golden domes, a successful combination of the old Russian architecture and Italian Renaissance, according to the wishes of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. The Facchetti Palace is also the work of Italian architects. Here, Russian history was irreversibly influenced when the members of Russia's royal family were assassinated. Tsar Peter the Great witnessed this event and subsequently founded St. Petersburg, his new capital city where he later reigned. The Kremlin is located on a 40-meter high hill above the Moskva River. And beyond its protective walls are numerous buildings, palaces, towers, squares, and churches. A fortress originated here in 1156. Later followed the Tsars. The city's history began with the construction of the Kremlin. It lay at the very heart of the city and was for centuries Russia's spiritual and political center. It was a time when Ivan ended the rule of the Mongols and married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Moscow became the Third Rome. The fortress of wood was transformed and palaces were built. Many Tsars left their traces here, as indicated by the diversity of the architecture. It's difficult to comprehend that the former hunting lodge of the sovereign Yuri von Sustal was transformed over the centuries into one of the most monumental complexes in the world. With sacred as well as worldly buildings that made history. A city within a city. The embodiment of power, and the former seat of power over the largest country on earth. The symbiosis of both church and state made the existence of Russia possible, with the Kremlin always at its center. Opposite the Kremlin, merchants built their own palace in 1894, what is now the Gum department store. A splendid building. 250 meters long, 3 shopping streets lead through the building on 2 floors. Protected from the weather by glass vaults, its 1,000 shops sell just about everything. Today, it's mainly Western companies that trade here. In front of the gates of the Kremlin, on the northern side of Red Square, is the merchant district of Kitaygorod. This was once the end of the old trading route from Vladimir. Traders and merchants who supplied the Tsar built their homes and churches here. Arbatskaya is a city district west of the Kremlin. In the 15th century, craftsmen and servants of the Tsar lived here. Then followed artists, intellectuals, and aristocrats. And today, tourists. This pedestrian area is the heart of the Arbat district, in which Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, and Bulgakov once lived. Some of Russia's most influential intellectuals of that time. And right up until today, artistic freedom is guaranteed here. Graffiti artists demonstrate their skills, young people play modern music, and everywhere, cameras capture the scene. Here once lived great artists in aristocratic surroundings. So a stroll through the famous shopping street is of much interest to those interested in art and literature. A fascinating world of poets and street performers. In the late 19th century, merchants replaced the aristocracy and demonstrated their wealth with huge apartments and splendid palaces. But when looking closely at the well-preserved classical Art Nouveau buildings, there are also symbols of communist socialism, as well as of Greek temple design. Each of these buildings is outdone by the Foreign Office, a gigantic skyscraper in Stalinist gingerbread style that transformed the city's appearance. The Redeemer Cathedral was destroyed and Stalin wanted the Congress Palace to be built here, a splendid construction. However, the plans were rejected and the cathedral was rebuilt. An expensive project, financed by the state, church, and various foreign companies. The next city district is Tverskaya. This is the home of Moscow's theatre life, dominated by the Bolshoi Theatre. It is one of the most famous musical stages in the world. The present building, a gem of classical architecture, was completed in 1856 after a number of devastating fires. The Tverskaya Ulitsa is the center of this district, a main street that since the foundation of the city led to Tver, Novgorod and St. Petersburg. It was the first Moscow street that in the 18th century had cobblestones laid, and whose old wooden houses were replaced with those of stone. Within the tranquil alleys are luxurious apartment buildings for a high-class clientele, and well-known hotels such as the Metropole and National. It's an impressive sight. This part of the city is one of Moscow's most expensive areas. In 1935, the metro was inaugurated and had 13 stations. Today, there are more than 100 located along 260 kilometers of rail used by millions each and every day. The Moscow Underground is fast, cheap, and quite splendid. Its stations are veritable works of art. Belaruskaya Station is named after a Belarusian station and one of the city's most beautiful. For Westerners, the stations were once great monuments of socialist overstatement. The central hall is white with stucco work on the ceiling. Wall mosaics feature rural scenes from Belarus. Novoslobodskaya Station is quite remarkable, and its colorful illuminated glass windows create the impression of daylight. The country's finest artists and architects were commissioned to create the various designs of Moscow's metro stations. Arbatskaya Station was built in two tubes, one on top of the other. The deeper one is truly opulent, with marble, stucco work, ceramic flower bouquets, and bronze chandeliers. Two stations away is Kievskaya, in which marble walls with abundant stucco ornamentation and golden chandeliers create a festive atmosphere. Mosaics feature Russia's historic association with the Ukraine. The splendor of the metro has only one explanation. It should be a temple of modernity against the church. a dream of the future that has turned into reality. The metro has always been an instrument of propaganda for Russia's socialist leaders. The New Virgin Monastery is the biggest and most beautiful monastery in Moscow. 15 buildings form a fairy tale complex, newly renovated and close to the river. The Mother of God of Smolensk Cathedral is the city's oldest religious building. Others, such as the Ambrosius Church, were built at the command of Sophia, the half-sister of Peter the Great. The 72-metre-high Baroque bell tower adds to the monastery's splendour. In the 17th century, the monastery owned much land. In 1689, Peter claimed the throne and sent Sophia to the monastery. To experience Moscow from the water is a fine experience. And there are numerous jetties from where one can embark on an enjoyable river tour. As the Kremlin passes by, it's easy to understand how the founder of the city, Sovereign Yuri, felt when he stood on top of a hill and looked down onto the river and the small village below. The boat travels past an entertainment park and the huge buildings that Stalin had ordered to be built, Moscow's gingerbread buildings. In summer, there's much river traffic because tourists as well as Muscovites enjoy traveling along the river. From the river, it's obvious that the city is subject to constant change. Many modern new buildings have appeared. But there's an even more impressive view of the ever-changing city from the Sperling Mountains. The panoramic view from here features a capital city that has been admitted to the exclusive club of the world's leading industrial nations. Huge new buildings almost obscure the view of the onion-shaped domes of the churches and monastery of the Old Town. But this city of contrast will continue to grow, a symbiosis of both old and new. Each of these ornate monumental buildings, Stalin's cathedrals that were built at a time of political arrogance, ensure that communism will be remembered for many years to come. No matter in which direction one turns, one of the city's 7 gingerbread-style skyscrapers can be seen. Monumental buildings in pseudo-Gothic architecture that dominate the city. The Donskoy Monastery is a place of legend. In 1571, the Krim Tatars besieged the city for the last time, and Tsar Fedor Ivanovich prayed within a tiny church. He placed the icon of God's Mother of Don on its walls, and the miracle of Moscow was born. The Tatars withdrew without a struggle. Tsar Boris Godunov had a monastery built here in honor of the Mother of God, and Regent Sophia later added an outer wall and various towers. The Muscovite aristocracy supported the improvements, and even the October Revolution did not affect the monastery, although its church was used as a crematorium. Outside the monumental entrance to Gorky Park is a merry-go-round. It was once the Park of the Tsars, with a pleasure palace, lake and meadows. Since the park was made open to the public, both Lenin and a hammer and sickle welcomed one and all. The Danilov Monastery is the oldest in Moscow. Indeed, it was the first monastery that, at the end of the Soviet era, was handed back to the church on its 100th anniversary. When in 988 AD, Vladimir I married the sister of the Byzantine emperor, was converted to the Orthodox faith, Christianity became the state religion. In 1282, Prince Daniel, youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, founded the Danilov monastery that was extended by Ivan the Terrible. The cathedrals of the 7 ecumenical church gatherings also features green onion-shaped domes. Today, the head of the Orthodox Church resides here, the Patriarch of Pimin. From the 15th century, Kolomenskoye was the summer residence of Moscow's royal families and later the Tsars. Following the revolution, this large park complex became a museum of architecture around the Christi Ascension Church. From all over Russia, famous wooden buildings were brought here and re-erected. And there are also the remains of the bell tower of the George's Church. Also the front gate, the impressive main entrance to Tsar Alexei's palace that was used for grand occasions. A fine building within the summer residence is the Church of God's Mother of Kazan, a fine example of Moscow Baroque, with light blue onion-shaped towers and golden stars. Around 70 kilometers north of Moscow is the monastery town of Sergeyev Posad, named after its founder, the holy Sergei Radonezhko. In the 14th century, one of the centers of the Russian Orthodox Church originated here. The monastery is a residence of the Patriarch of the whole of Russia. Born in 1314, the son of a Russian nobleman, entered a forest at the age of 23 and became a hermit. Soon other hermits joined him, so Russia's first monastery community came into being. Sergei became an abt, and until 1782 his monastery developed into a small town that was visited by faithful pilgrims as well as political potentates. The founder of the monastery was a man of high piety and authority. He reclaimed much land and had great influence on spiritual life. Tsar Boris Godunov improved the monastery following the dissociation of the Russian National Church from Constantinople. The Moscow Patriarch became a titular abbot. The monastery town of Sergeyev Posad features fascinating Russian architecture of bygone times. But it's more than just a monument. It's a living sanctuary of the Russian Orthodox Christians. The Russian soul is reflected in this city. Its melancholy, madness, heroism, weaknesses, mystique, and sanity. When the Tsar's empire vanished, the realm of the communist rulers was torn apart. But the mega-metropolis of Moscow has managed to survive. A restless and powerful city of fantastic culture and truly dramatic history.